Growing up, I always believed in love. Not the fairy tale kind with knights and dragons, but the real, messy, complicated kind. My parents had that kind of love. They weren't perfect, far from it, but they were committed to each other in a way that I admired. My mom used to say that love is like a garden. It needs care, patience, and sometimes a little bit of weeding. I took that to heart, and I was sure that one day I'd find someone who wanted to tend to that garden with me. I was born in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. It was the kind of place where you could see your entire future laid out before you by the time you were 10. Most of the girls I grew up with married their high school sweethearts, had kids, and settled into lives that mirrored those of their parents. I always thought that would be my path too, but life, as it turns out, had other plans. I met Alex during my first year of college. He wasn't from my town, he was from the city. With its bright lights and endless possibilities, I was drawn to him immediately. He had this confidence, this way of making everything seem so much more interesting than it actually was. We met at a party that neither of us wanted to attend. I was standing in the corner, nursing a drink and trying to decide if it was too early to leave, when he walked up to me and said, "You look like you're having the worst time of your life." I laughed, despite myself. Is it that obvious? He smiled, this crooked, charming smile, and said, "Only to someone who feels the same way." We spent the rest of the night talking, just the two of us. It was like we were in our own little bubble, where nothing else mattered. He told me about his dreams of becoming a lawyer, and I told him about my plans to become a teacher. We bonded over our shared love of old movies and bad pizza, and by the end of the night, I felt like I'd known him forever. Our relationship wasn't always easy. We came from different worlds, with different expectations and different ways of doing things. My parents were skeptical at first. They thought he was too worldly, too ambitious, too different, but I didn't care. I loved him, and I was sure that love would be enough to bridge any gap between us. We moved in together after a year of dating. It was a tiny apartment in the city, with barely enough room for the two of us. But it felt like home. We had our share of arguments, mostly about the little things: dishes left in the sink, laundry that never got folded, plans that were forgotten. But we always made up. Alex had this way of apologizing that made me forget why I was mad in the first place. He'd hold me close, whispering promises to do better, to be better, and I'd believe him. I wanted to believe him. The first real test of our relationship came when I got pregnant. We weren't planning on starting a family so soon, but life had a funny way of throwing us curveballs. When I told Alex, I expected him to be shocked, maybe even scared. But he just smiled that crooked smile and said, "Looks like we're going to be parents." I was overjoyed, but also terrified. I knew our lives were about to change in ways we couldn't even begin to imagine. The pregnancy was hard, harder than I expected. I was sick all the time, and I felt like my body was betraying me. Alex tried to be supportive, but I could see the strain it was putting on him. He was working long hours, trying to balance his job and his studies, and I could tell he was exhausted. We started arguing more, and the fights weren't about the little things anymore. They were about us, who we were becoming, and whether we were still the same people who had fallen in love that night at the party. When I miscarried, it felt like the bottom dropped out of my world. I was devastated, and I didn't know how to cope with the loss. I turned to Alex, hoping he could help me through it, but he was dealing with his own grief in a way that I couldn't understand. He shut down, retreating into himself, and I felt more alone than I ever had before. We tried to move past it, to pick up the pieces and carry on, but something had shifted between us. The garden of our love was starting to wither, and neither of us knew how to bring it back to life. After the miscarriage, things were never quite the same. We stayed together, more out of habit than anything else. We still loved each other, but the love felt different, less vibrant, less alive. We stopped talking about the future, stopped making plans. It was like we were just going through the motions, hoping that things would magically get better on their own, but they didn't. It wasn't until a year later, after another failed attempt to get pregnant, that I realized something had to change. I was sitting in our apartment, staring at the blank walls, and I felt this overwhelming sense of emptiness. I knew that if we didn't do something, we were going to lose each other completely. So I suggested we get married. I thought that maybe, just maybe, if we made that commitment to each other, it would bring us closer, remind us of why we fell in love in the first place. Alex was hesitant at first. He didn't see how a piece of paper could fix what was broken between us, but I was determined. I wanted to fight for us, for our future, and I convinced him that getting married was the first step. We didn't have a big wedding. Neither of us wanted that. Instead, we opted for a simple courthouse ceremony. It felt right, just the two of us, no distractions, no expectations. The day of the wedding, I was a bundle of nerves. I wanted everything to be perfect, even though I knew that perfection was impossible. As we stood before the judge, I looked at Alex and saw a flicker of the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago, the way he looked at me. The way he held my hand, it was like he was seeing me for the first time in a long time. When we said our vows, I felt this swell of emotion, this hope that maybe, just maybe, we could make this work. For exactly 3 minutes after the ceremony, everything was perfect. We walked out of the courthouse, hand in hand, and I felt like we were starting a new chapter in our lives. I was smiling, genuinely happy for the first time in months. And then, as we stepped onto the sidewalk, it happened. I was wearing this simple white dress, nothing fancy. But the hem caught on something, a crack in the pavement, maybe, and I tripped. It wasn't a big fall, just a stumble, but it was enough to throw me off balance. I laughed it off, expecting Alex to do the same, but instead he sighed and muttered under his breath, "God, you're so stupid." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stopped dead in my tracks, the smile fading from my face. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it, with this disdain, this irritation, like I was an inconvenience he had to tolerate. In that moment, everything became painfully clear. All the doubts, all the insecurities I had been pushing aside came rushing to the surface. But all I saw was impatience, frustration. It was like he didn't even realize the impact of his words, or worse, he didn't care, and that's when I knew. I knew that the man I had fallen in love with was gone, replaced by someone who didn't respect me, who didn't value me. Without a word, I turned around and walked back into the courthouse. My heart was pounding, and my mind was racing, but I knew what I had to do. The judge was still there, going over some paperwork. When he looked up and saw me standing there, his expression was one of surprise. "Is everything okay?" he asked, clearly confused. "No," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "It's not. I'd like to dissolve the marriage." The judge blinked, taken aback. "Are you sure?" he asked, his tone gentle but firm. I nodded. "Yes, I'm sure." It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I knew it was the right decision. The judge asked me a few more questions, but I barely heard them. I was too focused on the weight that had been lifted from my shoulders, the sense of relief that was slowly replacing the pain. The process was quick, almost clinical, and then it was done, our marriage, if you could even call it that. There was sadness, of course, and a deep sense of loss. But there was also a glimmer of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. Something better. I walked down the street, not sure where I was going, but knowing that wherever it was away from the life I had just left behind. I thought about all the things that had brought me to this point, the love, the heartbreak, the moments of joy and sorrow.